Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Weyes Blood called Titanic Rising. So I often find myself a little bit fascinated by the critically acclaimed indie blow-up story, mostly because I'm kind of curious whether they are as calculated as they might appear from the sidelines. And you might know how this goes. An indie act who normally has put in a couple albums that are well received but never quite beloved or super popular, they suddenly goes out to put a project. And it seems like without warning, a majority of critics have decided that this is the one to get on board with this artist. Their time is now. And the critical acclaim is so pronounced it almost seems extraordinary. Normally it's when the act puts out their most accessible project, but not always. Hell, at some points you find yourself wondering what the hell is so distinctive about this album that will drive folks bananas. And this doesn't tend to happen for your consistent critical darlings or your more widely popular hipster mainstays or even your one and done flukes, which often leaves me wondering why the hell it's this album for this artist at this time. The criteria feels kind of nebulous, and I have to feel a little bit sorry for the artists who might see their hype balloon for one album before it all evaporates for the next one when the formula that they have doesn't really change all that much. And thus, when we get to Natalie Mering, aka Weyes Blood, look, the signs are all there that this might be happening to her. She's been putting out albums in the underground for some time now that has split the difference between fuzzed out dream pop and more vintage Baroque textures. Think the opulence of the pop of the mid-60s before firmer grooves and a little bit more of a rough edge took hold in the latter half of the decade. And I've always thought her albums were okay, with some decent writing, but nothing that really jumped off the page or that I found truly riveting or a truly spellbinding hook, both on her own albums or some of her collaborations. And that seemed to be the critical consensus too. And yet suddenly this becomes a project that has won folks over en masse as one of the most critically adored projects of 2019, with fans who will just not shut the fuck up about it. Now, I'll admit it did kind of seem suspicious, but I was open to potentially this being amazing, so alright, I am intentionally very late to the punch with this. So what did we get from Titanic Rising? Well, I'll be honest. Up until yesterday, I wasn't sure if or when I would cover this at all. I've been listening to it for months now, on and off, but it had never quite clicked with me, and there was the very real possibility I'd just put it on the trailing edge, avoid the controversy, and move on. But then yesterday, I put up a Twitter poll with options for me to cover this week, either Aurora, Silver Sun Pickups, or something else. I didn't specify. Well, the something else option won. I figured that given there's still interest behind this project and fans that will not shut up about it, and the critical embers haven't really been diminished from any quarter, I'd give it another chance, another 6 or 7 listens. And look, folks, sometimes it just doesn't get there. I hear this project and I hear something that's certainly very pretty, very well arranged, and a blatant throwback to mid-60s pop, but it's also not something in Baroque pop that Julia Holter or especially Angel Olsen have an approach with more soul and poise, or even just raw compositional heft. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think this is bad by any means, but it feels like the equivalent of an Oscar bait movie. Very tasteful, obviously retro, and updated with just enough in the details to give the appearance of depth, but then feels kind of underwhelming with a little bit more thought and consideration. It'll probably wind up being forgotten within a year, and people start asking, wait, this got all the acclaim? But here's the thing. I completely understand how a project like this would resonate with a lot of critics on the sound alone. Hell, take the content on the surface into consideration, and I can see its appeal getting amplified by certain historical parallels to a similar tumultuous time in music and culture. You have a lush, often beautifully arranged backdrop that Mering co-produced with Jonathan Reddo of Foxygen, another artist who has built his recent career shamelessly cribbing from tones from the past without the complete context that he probably should have, where the classically trained vocals, they're stacked high, and the pianos, the strings, the guitars, they've got an organic pickup, the trace of modernity coming in through the smoky, gurgling touches of dream pop and some quasi-psychedelic synths, ever so slightly emphasizing that rising apocalyptic tide. And you know what? I'll give Mering a lot of credit for, at least on the surface, a synthesis of the old and the new, that marries old school Baroque pop glamour with enough modern updates to match the unnerving cultural fatalism that came through in the mid to late 60s to, Well, similar apocalyptic projections now. And let me stress, this isn't a new parallel. I might not give her a lot of praise, but Lana Del Rey did see and draw a similar aesthetic and content connection on the back half of Lust for Life. And it didn't work, but it was done before. And yet you could point to a similar incomplete picture of the history of pop music in that era, being why Lust for Life and Titanic Rising strike an odd and incomplete note for me. Because if you're looking at the politically charged, transgressive music of the late 60s and very early 70s that did cross over, it didn't sound like the classically opulent Baroque pop of that time. Sure, the Beatles, they had their psychedelic moments that got political and more lavish, but even they got leaner and rougher near the end and more experimental as the 60s continued on. Rock developed more teeth as it teetered towards early metal and proto-punk. It got heavier, and let's not touch on what soul and funk and R&B were doing with sharper grooves and a lot more visceral performances. The pop that Weyes Blood and Lana Del Rey, or even Portugal the Man brought in with Feel It Still, those tones might have their roots in the 60s, but not the revolutionary side. It was the happy-go-lucky dance crazes that picked up psychedelia because it made the drugs hit a little bit better, or had the budget for the classy, heavily arranged opulence. And then when you tack on some of the country and folk touches with the pedal steel, it's just icing here. You know, being a rebel, just for kicks. To the point where in 1970, in the tumult of the 60s seemed to be finally crashing in, pop music embraced even more garish opulence for increasingly stupid songs about how it's all gonna be okay and wonderful, it's all gonna be alright, thus triggering an early 70s where the Hot 100 took a sharp nosedive in quality. Go back to those old lists, it's not good. Now look, I don't expect the majority of people, or even critics, to have that larger historical context. That was damn near 50 years ago. And there was a likely correct assumption that relying on pure instrumental texture, that pure retro vibe, and a couple lyrical references to sketch the nostalgic parallel for an album that's riding on themes of life and love in the face of the apocalypse, that it would get there for them. But I also expect Natalie Mering to know that context, and thus it can't help but feel a little jarring to hear a similar brand of subtle fatalism in the content. The attitude that doom is inevitable, so why as well embrace the moment however you can, not quite succumbing to despair so openly, but with the larger emptiness that's coloring the backdrop. It's always there. It's the reason why so much of the actions take place. It's this hollow and almost blinkered approach that might feel a little bit romantic on the surface, especially as Natalie Mering is a good enough writer to frame a lot of these songs as desperately optimistic, which is a better path than what Lana Del Rey did. But it doesn't move me. Doesn't grip me. And that's the most frustrating thing about Titanic Rising, where even on the album title and art calls to mind the great catastrophes of human hubris at sea, where the water is again rising higher but for different reasons. Because on some level I can see that if this had been framed more as melodrama, like Titanic the movie was, the grand swells of emotion, they could have worked. But Weyes Blood is way too tasteful and refined for that. I put more of the blame on the production, because I can see spots in the lyrics where the self-awareness kind of almost gets there. Or at the very least, there could be some genuine yearning power that would transcend it. I like how Andromeda knows that the faraway galaxy is no escape if you can't live here. You gotta find some way to make it work, and even if you're downbeat about it, there's a possibility. I appreciate how she highlights the disposability of relationships on every day, and yet I love how damn hard she yearns for it all to work on Mirror Forever, wishing for the stars of movies until she has to stare into her own eyes, her own reflection, and confront a reality in which she might not be ready. And I like how the writing elevates the flawed, messy humanity on the back of this album for all the right reasons, where she wishes the love they cherish was enough to believe in amidst the world that's coming apart in a wild time, that it was worth it. And you'd think that would inspire production to soar, the melodic climax to feel grand, but for me it always winds up feeling like the songs are a half step away from really nailing that melodic swell or ending effectively. And what's exasperating is that there's no one place I can put all the blame. I could place some of it on the tempo, with 2 instrumental interludes. We only have 8 songs, with each averaging about 5 minutes apiece, that are nearly all mid-tempo, and yet even then the melodic transformations always feel a little too measured, a little bit too poised, limited urgency that the beauty can never be really disrupted. Oh, these songs are layered, they're dense, make no mistake about that, but a core tune outside of the vocal melody, the motif that rips off a solo or a moment of quiet to really drive home a sense of dynamics, kind of gets lost in the pomp and circumstance, and it hurts a a lot of these songs to help them stand out. I mean, imagine how effective the acoustic intimacy of Picture Me Better could have been if they didn't pile in all the multi-tracking, tack on the strings, a really subdued, low-key closer that could have been beautiful. But you know what? Maybe that's the root of some of the problems here. Songs like A Lot's Gonna Change in movies, they both start with this somewhat ominous minor key synths, and in the latter case almost seem to take compositional cues from Muse of all people with the arpeggiated progressions. But while they will then open up into these beautiful strings accented lush arrangements, the groove, it never revs up to break free beyond the percussion just getting that much louder, or deliver a huge hook where Mering can cut loose vocally on her own without the need of all the multi-tracking, which is a further distancing effect, or even bring up the slightest hint of vibration to show what's at stake. Or if they do bring an abrasive element in, it's a discordant moment driven off modern production and synths rather than a guitar with some more organic fire. You can tell Movies is really trying to get there with its blocky percussion and the sawing strings, but in that case, the layering piles up to a point where a clarion point of melodic climax from the vocals is drowned out. Instead of allowing for a graceful fade out, it sounds like somebody pulled the cord out of the keyboard. And that's not counting the odd percussion cadence and the fizzy layering against the overpolished keening tones and the flat synth foundation on Mirror Forever, which might have worked with the slightest hint of spare restraint, or tones that felt a little bit more organic to actually match with all the multi-tracking. I'll give some credit to Andromeda for the sputtering hints of psychedelic texture and the pedal steel to amplify the spacey, quasi-country sound, especially with that organ on the third verse. It's the obvious album standout. It's a lead-off single for a reason, especially with that melodic pivot I really liked in the hook. And a similar formula works pretty well on Something to Believe too. Hell, there are the couple of songs here where a good foundational groove can convincingly materialize and work. But for as much as that works there, picking up the clunky Beatles-esque piano line and Beach Boys harmonies for Every Day, to me it doesn't rise to more like a pastiche, even if I do like the strings there. Especially with how the song self-destructs at the end, it winds up sounding less like a Beatles-esque melodic psychedelic breakdown and more like a lost, underwhelming moment that was cut from Be Here Now. And while I think that Wild Time is a little bit better thanks to the acoustic piano combination and an attempt at some genuine swell with all those warbles of horns and the strings piling in for that final crescendo, it still ends with an abrupt simp burble that feels like an underwhelming payoff. I mean, if you're going for this extravagant melodrama for songs to soar to the stars stacked this deep, at least let them play out. At least let them fade out gracefully. But at the end of the day, look, I don't mind gloriously arranged pop drama or melodrama. I keep wishing Marianas Trench would do more of it when they go pop. Natalie Mering, she's got the vocal control and the poise and the presence to deliver both. She's a beautiful singer. But between the weird fatalistic distance manufactured in the retro callback, if you know, you know, to a lack of subtler moments in production that wants to go big but misses that the best ways to emphasize it are strong tunes and to go small at points for contrast, I mean, this feels pretty, but it's also shallower than it should be. I absolutely get the appeal, don't get me wrong, especially with how other critics have evoked the term cinematic, but it feels like a period piece that got enamored with the fashion and the gravitas of the time and the event and the sweeping tracking shots to miss that there might be a good script or good acting at the core. Not saying that it's not there, but the fine details aren't getting the emphasis they deserve. And thus, to me, you know, I'm gonna piss a lot of you off. I'm sorry, but it's a strong 6 out of 10. And while every other critic has already praised this to hell and back, I'm sorry, I can't. It's good, but it's definitely worth a listen or two. But if this fades out than many people expect, or when people look back later and say this was overrated, don't say I didn't warn you. That's all it is. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I know this review is going to cause a lot of you to unsubscribe because, hey, I did this before. It happened with Igor a couple weeks ago, and it will happen again here. I'd like to think that me expressing some opinions or maybe shedding light on stuff that you hadn't seen before would keep you on board, but hey, it happens. I'm not here to validate what you want to say. I'd rather be honest. My credibility's worth more. But hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. And I got the poll up there for y'all to tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you want to look for where Billboard Breakdown is, it's on a new channel. I have to keep saying this, and it's over in the card, linked over here. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.